Welcome, everyone, to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. This week, we'd like to welcome back once again our regular guest, Kvelduflr Gundarsson, who has the summer off, which is why we're having a number of chances to meet with him, and we probably won't have as many during the winter. So we're taking advantage of that now. And today we're going to look at his fount of knowledge on Scandinavian and Northern hunting traditions. And again, I'm just going to turn it over to you, Kvelduflr.
Okay. This is the time of year when even quite settled civilized people start to think about hunting. The animals are fat from having had good meals all through the summer. The little ones are grown up enough to take care of themselves. Most prey animals are not pregnant at this time. So it's a good time to be out hunting. Now, hunting is part of the oldest stratum of our ancestral tradition. When we followed the glacier and the caribou up as they retreated through northern Europe and made our way to Scandinavia, our people were hunter-gatherers. The common Scandinavian term for this period in time is actually the hunting Stone Age, to distinguish it from the agricultural farming Stone Age. And at the time, Scandinavia was pretty much, at least coastal Scandinavia, was a hunter-gatherer's paradise. There were a large number of large animals about, elk, boar, bear, a plethora of smaller animals, and of course the coastlines at the time, especially as the glaciers were just pulling back, were extremely rich with seal, fish, whatever you could want. So it's no surprise that the oldest body found in Sweden, the first Swedish settler, whom some people call Mother Sweden, was buried with her hunting kit. In fact, the body was first thought, because of the grave goods, to be male, but she had quite a number of children, and by quite a number I mean somewhere in the region of the high teens, which, although it can be difficult to sort out male from female skeletons, or at least it was before we got good DNA testing, with that many kids, there are unmistakable changes in the female pelvis. So this was a woman who was buried with her arrows and such for hunting, largely small game. There's no record surviving, but we can probably take it, as in most hunter-gatherer cultures, that the women would be more likely to shoot any small game they came across while they were out gathering fruits, nuts, leaves, and all the other things that you also need to survive if you're a hunter-gatherer, whereas the men would more likely cooperatively go after the larger and more dangerous animals, the elk, the wild boar, the bear, and what have you. At least that's our best guess. Certainly, Mother Sweden's hunting kit looked like it was largely designed for shooting hares and squirrels and other such small game, which makes perfect sense. If you're out gathering and you see a hare or a squirrel, why not shoot it?
Well, and it fits with what we know of the hunters and gatherers that were still around when they started doing anthropological films and stuff in the 1960s and 70s, that when women hunt, and it is not true that women never hunt in these societies. There are a few where it's very rare, but most of the women hunt some, but they only hunt big game if there is any, usually when they're very young or they have no children, and it's usually sort of like a lady softball player today who might actually be considered for the big leagues in baseball. We haven't crossed that line yet, but we may at some point, and that's what it was like usually.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good comparison, and as in most societies, it's not unlikely that there was the occasional proto-maiden warrior, maiden hunter, who bucked the trend, may even have been ritually considered male, who knows? We don't know anything like enough about early Stone Age Scandinavian culture to even guess on that one. But we do know, at any rate, that hunting was a crucial thing. In fact, the hunting dogs of the day, which are identical to the modern Norwegian elk hound, were buried with their masters, and like human bodies, they were sprinkled with red ochre. Again, we are not exactly sure what the red ochre symbolized, but best guess is that it was probably related to life, to the afterlife, and these were certainly animals that were already man's best friend and closest companions. And of course, I'd mentioned previously, in fact, I've mentioned many times, that hunting cultures, hunter-gatherer cultures, tend to be shamanic. It's almost a dead certainty that our hunting-gathering ancestors in Scandinavia were at that time a shamanic culture. And so some elements of those beliefs managed to continue long after we had ceased to be a shamanic culture. In fact, managed to continue in some form, some of them, all the way to the present day. Particularly the very strong identification with both clan and individual totem animals. And one of the things that's interesting to notice is that the favored animals, with the notable exception of the stag, which I will get back around to later probably in this discussion, tend to be predators. People were identifying, certainly in the migration and Viking age, very, very probably going back all the way, with the wolf, with the bear, occasionally with the boar, although boars are omnivores, they're pretty ferocious.
And on the very, very early end, there has been recently a lot of publicity about a cave found in France, which is called in French the Cave of the Cats. And I can't remember the exact dating, but it's in the 20 to 30,000 year ago range. And it is the most spectacular paintings of big cats, of apparently cave lions, that were so detailed, for example, that we now know that cave lions males had no manes. Why did we know this? Because, well, just like they knew that people did everything, they pretty much showed cats doing everything. And there is a pair of cats making more cats, and the male has no mane. But the interesting thing about it is, well, there are very few depictions of people, and they're not all that well done. It's obviously that these predator cats are some sort of incredibly important probably totem animal for them, which, were there any cave lions left by the migration age? Or?
Oh no, long gone.
So by that point, the wolves are probably going to be your largest cat. Not cat. Sorry, your largest. It's been a long week,
yeah,
folks.
I mean, bears technically, again, they're omnivores, but they'll happily kill and eat whatever they can find to kill and eat.
But you have this identification with predators going way, way back, and it was, the archaeologists think that people were hunting like the cats.
Right, and of course, as we move later on, as we move into a more organized and warlike culture, come the migration age, the hunter-predator then becomes the battle-predator. So we have another layer of this showing up in the migration and Viking age, and we have, instead of primarily the hunter as predator, which is probably what we were seeing in the Stone Age, we move on to the warrior as predator, but it comes from the same root. Now, the one exception to this is the stag, and the stag is an animal of very considerable importance, very considerable nobility. It's described as the fetch of a king. It's the animal with which Sigurður Volsung is very strongly associated. And interestingly enough, Sigurður is killed when he's out with a hunting party. He's literally hunted. The same thing happens to the magician Thorir Hirtir. He's literally hunted down by, as he's in the form of a stag, the fetch form of a stag, by Olafur Tryggvason's probably Irish wolfhound. And this wasn't just a literary motif. One might come to suspect that, but one of the most interesting surviving folk rites in Scandinavia, it hasn't been written about much, but it's at a place called Knutshoved in Denmark. And this place once a year has, or at least had up into the 20th century, a communal ritual in which a man was chosen to play the part of a stag, dressed up, was chased around from village to village by the other men who were firing at him with blank cartridges, until he was finally, quote, killed, unquote, and borne back on a sledge so that the celebrations could start. Now, this ritual, there's no way to prove it because it's just something that's been happening and no one wrote about it until comparatively recently. But both Jan de Vries suggested, and I think he's probably right, that this probably goes back all the way to the hunting Stone Age. This is probably one of the oldest rites we have.
Well, the idea of the stag being hunted is a part of a lot of European traditions.
It is, and it's the idea of the hunt as something that takes you out beyond the world we know, out beyond the borders of the Middlegarth, is practically a commonplace in later medieval and Renaissance literature. The knight always sees a white hart or a mysterious maiden or an old witch or whatever, yada yada, while he's out hunting, because he's out in the woods. He's out beyond the world we know. This isn't quite such a huge literary motif in the Norse, but it does show up occasionally. For instance, the saga of Tyrfingr, the sword Tyrfingr, begins with a king hunting a stag, which turns out to be the daylight form of a dwarf. And eventually he coerces the dwarf into making this sword for him, and then he and his descendants, for several generations, get into huge amounts of trouble with it, the moral of which is don't screw with the dwarves. But the idea, as with Sigurd's death, is that out on the hunt is where anything can happen. And it is no surprise, given that we have a lot of folklore and a certain amount of surviving godlore dealing with the hunt, dealing with how do we keep ourselves safe and come back with the food that will help us get through the winter. When we're out in this wild place, when we're out in the borderlands.
I have a question before we totally leave the animals, and it also fits in with, because the stags were such an important part of the hunting tradition. Is it possible that the stag became associated in the way that so many of the predators were with the fact, I've lived in Colorado and I've heard stags when they go at each other and during the mating season, and they are great beasts of battle.
Yes, I think that's very likely. They're great beasts of battle, they're noble beasts, they're very tall, and they've got those horns. And remember, when I'm talking about stags here, this might be confusing to Americans. Probably what is being referred to by the stag word in Old Norse is the animal that over here we call a red deer, and in the States you'd call an elk. Over here, the word elk is what we use for what an American would call a moose. But when we're talking about stags, deer, red deer, we've got several different varieties of deer, but the overwhelming one is those magnificently crowned, I think it's actually Kronhjert, crowned stag, crowned hart in Swedish. It is that same animal you think of as an elk in America with the magnificent horns. And heroes are often enough compared to the stag. I believe Helgi is compared to a stag standing high in the forest. Sigurður is compared to a stag. It was very much considered a beast of nobility. Not so much a battle beast in the sense, say, of the three beasts of battle, the wolf, raven, and eagle, that actually chow down on the corpses afterwards. But certainly very much a noble warrior, certainly very much a king's fetch.
Because the air simply rings with the crashing. It's if you've never heard it, it's just amazing, and it must have been even more amazing without any kind of modern sounds.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting during the Bronze Age is that frequently on the picture stone carvings, we see ships that are proud with elk's heads or elk's antlers. There seems to be this close association, which is very appropriate, especially when you consider that the European elk can swim. I mean, the European elk can really swim in the sense of can swim from Sweden to Denmark, and occasionally do. They just cross that wee strait there, rather than taking the ferry and buying booze like everyone else coming from Sweden. Sorry, Swedish friends, but you do, and you know it.
All that cheap alcohol.
Yes, the thought of a drunk elk is a scary thought, and we see those occasionally too, because they're very fond of wandering into apple orchards at just that time of year when the apples are fermenting on the ground, and they can get drunk and they can get stroppy. But that's another thing, and a bit off the topic of hunting, except that if you live, a little out in the country, in a country that has elk and have the good fortune to have an apple orchard, it's a really good place to lie in wait.
I suppose the meat would be kind of self-marinated.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, assuming that you don't have a handy apple orchard full of fermenting apples and drunk elk, you have to go out there into this realm that borders on the other world, that is ruled and inhabited by a great variety of otherworldly beings of various levels of friendliness. And not only that, you're doing so in an intrinsically dangerous situation. With modern weapons, we don't really think that much about how dangerous it is to go hunting unless we're actually hunting really large and dangerous game like bears or, some of the African animals and such. But even hunting a deer or an elk, let alone a wild boar, which are very, very dangerous indeed, or a bear, there is a fair amount of risks involved. There's if you're going out in a group with missile weapons, you have to worry about accidentally shooting one of your own party if you're not well organized. The woods are dangerous places, and a wounded deer can also be extremely dangerous. They're big, they've got hooves, they've got horns, they're not happy about it, and unless you're a very good shot with an arrow, it's not all that unlikely that you might end up having to go in close and cut the animal's throat to finish it off, which is not such a safe thing to have to do. And of course, there is the other danger, the danger that you won't find anything, and that as a result your family will go hungry. So you're out there in the wilds, you're caught between two or several possible dangers, just ignoring the fact that, trucking around in the wilderness, you can always break your leg, get snake bit, although that's not such a big deal in Northern Europe because all we've got are adders anyway, but, all sorts of things can happen. So how did our ancestors deal with this? Who did they call on? How did they do it? What did they do for their hunting luck? From the earliest period that we have much information about, or any information about, aside from our knowledge that the Stone Age folk were obviously doing something, but we don't know much about their rituals. We're not even 100% sure about most of their amulets, although it's not a bad guess that when you see, for instance, an amber carving of a wild animal, like the swine and deer type critters from Stone Age Denmark, it's reasonable odds that if those were amuletic, that they were hunting amulets of some sort, or possibly involved with propitiating these spirits, the gods, whoever was being worshipped and involved with hunting at the time. Once we get into the Bronze Age, we actually see a number of hunting scenes carved on the picture stones, and it's pretty reasonable to assume that there was a religious or magico-religious element to that, given that most of the carvings on the picture stones seem to be of ritual significance. And they weren't all that easy to carve with the tools of the time, so I think we can rule out casual graffiti. Now, when we see something like the carving on the underboards of the Oseberg ship, which also shows a hunting scene, deer, arrow, and so forth, it's, kind of scratched on, and it's under the boards, and chances are that was just somebody bored one day.
Right.
But the picture stones showing, Bronze Age picture stones showing hunting scenes, it's fairly good odds that something was going on there.
Are there any locations in northern, in far northern Europe with the cave paintings in the early period as you see in the South?
No.
So the first thing you're really getting is the picture stones?
Pretty much.
And those would be Bronze Age?
Those would be Bronze Age.
Okay.
Okay, so what we have from Viking Age lore, once it actually starts getting written down, is we have two deities which are particularly associated with hunting, who are Utlr and Skadi. They're associated with hunting, Utlr particularly with the bow, both of them with travel on snowshoes or skis, winter travel, and it's the worship of both of them is particularly strong, as at least suggested by place names in southeastern Sweden and southeastern Norway, and it's been suggested that one or both of these deities might originally have been Suomi, Finnish, because there's a Finnish pair of hunting deities, Tapio and his wife Miliki, who seem to bear a considerable resemblance to Skadi and Utlr. They shoot, they go around on skis and snowshoes. We have a lot more information on the worship of these two in Finland than we have on Skadi and Utlr. And one of the things that also stands out is that particularly the practice of making an offering of silver, little bit of silver if you had it, copper if you didn't, when you went into the woods. It's not that we know of, and we don't know much, associated with Skadi and Utlr, but it is very strongly rooted in the Scandinavian tradition of the being called in Sweden Skolsraut, the forest ruler. It's a female title, and when you go out into the woods, when you start your hunt, you want to give a little bit of silver to Skolsraut. Now, what I personally do is I purchased a large number of, old coins, relatively cheap, but real silver. And I have this stash, and I take one with me to make my offering with every time I go out to hunt.
Are you is this sort of like either permission or guild for what you might be taking, or
a bit of both, and also just keeping up a good rapport, because Skolsraut is actually, if approached properly, a very friendly being. Sometimes she's a very, very friendly being. because, here is your guy, your hunter, and he's out in the woods for an indefinite period of time, all on his lonesome, and just as the girls who are isolated up on the sheelings taking care of the cattle are particularly vulnerable to the charms of elf men. I don't doubt that was many a pregnant young lady's story, and she was sticking to it. But the lone hunter, or even the pair of hunters, are very much in a position to be accosted by Skogsrot. And this is a very good thing, assuming you don't tell your wife about it afterwards, or you don't predecease her. There have been surprises post-funerals. There's one story about a hunter who, died, left his wife grieving with the 3 kids, and then this woman in green comes up to her and says, "Don't cry, he left me with 7.
Ooh, ouch.
Yeah. But, if Skogsrot comes to you and you do a good job, make her happy, then chances are you'll get some very good game.
So we sort of have here, interestingly enough, a combination of hunting and sex magic.
Very much so. And the animals are very much seen as belonging to Skogsrot. There's one Swedish folk story where Skogsrot comes to a couple of guys out hunting, and they do what she wants them to, and all's well. And she says something to the effect of, "Nice job, guys. Tomorrow one of you will shoot my dog, and the other will shoot my cat." And one of them got a bear, and one of them got a lynx.
Oh, so they are actually still hunting the cats. They're
still hunting the cats. They're still hunting, whatever is huntable for the skins, as well as the food. But the point is that the animals of the forest are seen as Skogsrot's domestic animals.
So it's basically like her cattle or her sheep, only they're her pets, and she can
and
give them out.
You could think of the deer as her cattle, what have you. Something else that's interesting about Skogsrot is that she's obviously kept up pretty well with modern technology, because she has been known to evaluate hunters' rifles. She will come and look at a rifle and decide if it's good or bad, and if it's good, she'll bless it, and that will be a very lucky rifle thereafter.
That's really interesting. Are those like just recent tales of hunters and things that come out?
Recent is kind of a variable term.
18th century?
Yeah. We're talking the folklore collection period here, roughly 18th century onward.
Yeah, so by then she's sort of a spirit figure.
Yeah. We don't know if Skogsrot ever was the same person as Skadi. If she's a form of Skadi, I don't think so. Just in the beliefs in her are so evenly and widely spread. If they were focused on the areas where Skadi's cult was strongest, we might be a bit suspicious. But there certainly seems to be a fair amount of overlap. Certainly the hunting customs overlap quite a bit.
You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages. Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melody, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melody with an I, psychicreadings.com, for information, or email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today? We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future.
one thing that's kind of interesting that we don't see in the Scandinavians so much, at least not any time in recorded time, is the sort of elaborate interactions between the hunter and the animal that are seen in a number of other cultures. I can't think of any recorded, hunting Christian prayers, for instance, such as you see in the Celtic. In the Gaelic, there's a fair number of them blessing the animal, what have you. But there really doesn't seem to be much like that in the Scandinavian, and probably the sharpest contrast is the difference between the way the Finns and the Sami hunt bear and the way the Scandinavians hunted bear. And with the Scandinavian bear hunt, you can see the echoes of this almost circumpolar bear culture. You see guys going out, as I mentioned in our session on bears, talking to the bear one-on-one, treating the bear really like a fellow human being in some regards.
They said this is the Scandinavian.
And this is the Scandinavian.
Okay.
But what we don't see is these huge, elaborate ceremonies, bringing the bear to the village, holding a celebration, offering a girl as the bride of the bear, very elaborate messing about with not breaking the bones, and how the bear is properly interred to make the bear and others happy. You get all these lengthy things in particularly the Finnish, and there's a whole chapter in the Kalevala describing the bear hunt for anyone who's interested in that. Just look at a copy of the Kalevala. There's this massive, detailed section on it.
And it also goes all the way around the world. You find it in Japan, you find it in the Northwest Coast. Native Americans that are that far north.
Yeah, it really seems to be a circumpolar deal.
Yeah.
But, the Finns will go on about how we weren't the ones that killed you, you tripped on a stone, and so on and so forth. We honor you, so, they've got about a Brazilian complimentary kennings, or by names for the bear. And you really don't see that in the Scandinavian, although the importance of the bear and the sense of the bear as both a holy animal and the animal nearest to human is preserved. And I think the difference there again goes back to that distinction between the shamanic, the direct communication with the hunted animal, the direct relationship, and the religious, where it's a more indirect relationship where you go through the gods first.
It's also interesting that the bit about the bear being the closest to human, because you find that in the Northwest Coast Native Americans as well, especially not the ones in the furthest north, but the ones that are just a little bit further down in a similar location.
Yeah, well, some of those bones, even an experienced pathologist can't tell the difference without doing genetic testing. If you've ever seen a bear skeleton, it looks eerily like a large human skeleton with a bear's skull on top of it. And since our ancestors were in the habit of among other things, hanging bears up on trees as possibly a hunting-related religious rite, we don't know for certain, but this was done on the island of Frishhu, Frere's Lake, where there was a very significant moot, and it was a major area for hunting, for fur trading, and so forth. So there's been a lot of discussion about, was one of the religious aspects of this moot hunting related? Were they hanging up these bears on the birch tree as a hunting offering? Does this indicate a more generalized relationship between the Vanik cult and hunting? Well, again, we're in this massive not enough data. We don't actually know. We can only guess area.
I do have a related question, though, and that is, you mentioned that Ulthar and Skadi are both found on skis, or portrayed a lot on skis or snowshoes. Does that mean hunting often was more important in winter, or done more in winter?
I think so. I think that's extremely likely. And more in autumn, but it can snow pretty early in Scandinavia.
Considering we're recording this in August and it's now snowing in Colorado and in parts of Northern Europe, in Sweden, I think, yeah, that's real early this year, but it probably did it sometimes that early back then too. And if it did, even in the agricultural period, your crops are probably toast. So the hunting suddenly becomes vastly more important, as would, I suspect, any rituals concerning it.
And that leads us to some of the bizarre stuff that was going on in Greenland. I've mentioned this previously. These very strange finds in the Christian churchyard at Garthur, with these incredibly elaborately incised walrus skulls and whatnot being laid out in lines inside the churchyard. Now in Greenland, of course, they were much more dependent on hunting. I've mentioned before that I think that had it not been for the influence of Christianity, they might have re-evolved all the way back to a hunting shamanic culture. But there was certainly something very, very, very interesting going on there, even with the Christian influence. There seems to have been the rudiments of what I think would have, in the due course, evolved into a full-out sea beast hunting cult.
Now, for the benefit of some of my listeners that may not know, can you explain a little bit about what happened in Greenland from the time that they got there and why they would be going to hunting?
Okay, what happened in Greenland? They got to Greenland in around the end of the 10th century ish, and things were still pretty warm then. I think it was still a tick warmer than it is today. The world had not started cooling yet. Unfortunately for them, in their lovely warm climate, and the water was a little bit higher. When we were in Sweden, I had a Swedish friend point out to me roads that were sailing roads during the Viking Age. So okay, the world was a slightly nicer place then. But what they didn't know, unfortunately for them, was that they were about to head into the Little Ice Age. And when they got to Greenland, it was reasonably cultivatable, not as good as even Iceland, and the Greenlanders were already moving to a much more animal product-heavy diet. They ate a lot of milk, they ate a lot of sea beasts. They knew that their lifestyles were changing. There's an interesting story of one guy who's, he moved in with the new wife and the newborn son, and the wife died of something or other, and there wasn't a wet nurse around. So he cut into his nipple, and first blood came out, and then clear fluid, and then milk. Now this phenomenon, one has been documented in times of stress, even in World War II. Both men and women can produce milk, and in fact do produce milk whenever their dopamine levels go low enough, or in the case of women, usually prolactin is stimulated by the whole process of pregnancy and birthing and what have you. But basically men can and do, under great stress, produce milk. And people were looking at the guy funny because here we are, very, very masculine normative Viking culture, and here's a big strong guy who's nursing his kid from his own womb. I think that's the only word there.
I was going to, yes, definitely.
And he said, this is Greenland now, and we have to learn to do things differently.
Ooh. That also suggests they comprehended that things were getting harsher.
They comprehended that things were getting harsher, that the lifestyle was different. Their diet had to be different. They were all, as I said, already shifting to much more animal food, much less plant food. Diet much closer to those of the natives nearby them. And, well, the weather just kept getting worse. And unfortunately, as it turned out, the Greenland settlers were mostly converted already. They clung to their Christianity as the emblem of being European. They largely, as a group, stayed as separate as they could from the natives, rather than what I think might have happened otherwise. And some of the things that were going on, such as the hunting proto-cult, if you like, may suggest that there was more interaction than the records show. But at any rate, things kept getting worse, and, ships came less and less often from Europe. And we used to think they all died out. We used to think that when the Black Plague came to Greenland, that was just, the last straw, and there was one late 14th century graveyard found with these poor little malnourished bodies dressed in the latest European fashions that they'd obviously heard about from the last ship in, and we used to think they all just got sick and died. Now, more recent investigations have shown that might have been part of what was going on, but mainly what was going on was these kids grew up hearing about Europe, thinking about Europe, and more the young people said, we're out here in the back of nowhere. We're out in the boonies. We're never going to get anywhere. Sod this, I'm taking the next ship back to Europe.
Yeah, so there was a very, very interesting interview I heard with again, I don't think it was the same guy that I was talking about last week, but might have been one of the native Greenland elders who is also Western educated, and he basically said, "Oh, yes, the Norse, we remember them. They're in our legends too, but you people never ask about them. We know exactly what happened." And the researcher said, okay, so what happened? Oh, well, one day the men all sailed off and left their women and children, and we took them in. And it was just very matter of fact. Now, we have to take into account that this guy probably had seen television. He might have seen, the Vikings for all I know. When you're dealing with later period comments by elders of anybody's nation, you have to take in that even the best intentions can have been influenced. But it was something about the way he said it that made me think, yeah, that probably isn't the legends, because it's very common with anthropologists, especially in the 20th century, to not, and 19th century even more so, to not have asked the questions.
Right, and that which brings us also back to the topic of hunting, and to one of the most interesting episodes in the sagas, which in fact is dealing with one of the settlers of Greenland, Thorhakler Veðimaður, Thorhakler the huntsman, who was in fact a heathen, and went along on the settlement of Finland. Now the Vinlanders got there in a bad period. They had a bad winter. They were starving. And one day Thorhakler wandered off, and after a while one of his mates came on him lying on the edge of a cliff, pulling faces, acting oddly, and he was composing a praise poem to Thor. And Thor responded instanter by sending a beached whale. Now the colonists obviously were not so bright, because they'd been starving a while. They tucked into the rich meat excessively, and then they got sick, and the Christians among them said, "Ooh, pagan meat, we're sick because of it." Silly people. Should have known better. But why this is interesting is because people don't think of Thor as a god of the hunt usually. You think of gods of the hunt. You think of Uttler and Skadi, and some people have floated the odd theory about Freyr and the woodlands and so forth. Though that's a lot harder to explain or justify, but it's been floated. But when you think about hunting, it wasn't just a land thing. We tend to forget that, and most modern Westerners, we think of hunting as something that you do pretty much in the woods or down by the lake if you're after duck or whatever, because unless you live somewhere like Greenland or Newfoundland, chances are you're not going to be spending a lot of time hunting seals, let alone whales. But to our ancestors, seals were a major staple. Whales were a major staple. And Thor, and not to mention the odd walrus, especially if you were in Greenland, and Thor seems to be the god responsible for at least some of the big sea beasts. And when you think about the story in Humaskvida, you think about Thor and Humor going out to fish for whales, and Thor eventually using one of them to bait Jörmungandr, who understandably unhappy about being hauled up from the depths and bopped on the head. I wouldn't like it either. But there you go. No wonder the snake holds a bit of a grudge there. But at any rate, Thor is very much associated with storms at sea. You could, if you liked, and many people have, called him the patron of fishers, especially fishers who tell the story about the big one that got away.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Is modern West, especially Americans, and I think Europeans as well, tend to separate out hunting and fishing, but I don't think that traditional people would have.
I don't think traditional people would have, and even when you're talking about freshwater fishing in Scandinavia, I've mentioned Skolsrauet. We also have Kvelduflr, the lake ruler, who again is a female being who is very much responsible for the fish in the lake. Now, you don't tend to get the sort of romantic tales and close interaction with her that you do with Skolsrauet, mainly because, fishing is freshwater fishing is kind of a do-it-by-day activity, as opposed to a truck out into the woods for a week or two kind of activity. But she's there, and propitiation is considered important.
Whereas hunting or fishing for larger fish, particularly at sea, for fish and sea mammals, would be, you do have to go out on the boats. You do have to be gone sometimes for at least all day or often for several weeks.
Exactly. And you notice I mentioned that seals were a major staple, not only for meat, although, they are indeed very nice to eat. It's a nice, very rich, dark meat. A little fishy, maybe. It's kind of like a good tender beef with Worcester sauce on it or something. Stop making faces. I know you don't like fish.
I don't like fish. I will point out, though, that while I have never been hunting, even though I don't like fish, my father owned a bait and tackle shop for a while and taught me to fish at a very young age. So I do understand it. I'm very good at it. And the thing about freshwater fishing or even sea fishing on a boat that is close in, if you're doing it with a line, it's part of it is the ability to be very still and very quiet, which I know doesn't sound like me, but it's a skill that you have to learn. I imagine that hunting has skills like that as well.
Very much so. Being quiet is pretty crucial. But back to the seals. And this is also back to the topic of going out on a boat for longer periods, as you tend to have to do when you're hunting the large sea mammals. Seals are one of the spookiest critters in the entire northern corpus. You frequently get dead people taking the shape of seals, such as Killer Cropper and Thorguna. You get people going out from their bodies in the form of seals, generally with the intention of doing something unpleasant to people in boats. And you get seals turning into humans. The Selkie legends, and particularly that very common Northern European motif of the stolen skin, forcing a Selkie bride to remain with a human man. These are extremely common tales, both in the Norse and the Celtic, possibly unique to the Norse, although I don't know for sure that it's not in the Celtic. is the belief that seals are actually dead people. And there's a few different renditions of this from Iceland to Orkney. Some say they're the souls of the drowned. Some say they're the souls of suicide. There's a later Icelandic thing saying that they're the Pharaoh's army who was drowned when the Red Sea closed back. But there is this constant sense of seals as very supernatural.
Well, if you've ever seen a seal skeleton on the beach, and I have, they look amazingly like people. Yeah,
they're creepy. Because they again, the basic shape, the skeleton looks remarkably human, and then you've got what looks like a very, very canine head on it, complete with sharp teeth, and these weird little deformed limbs. But they are eerily human. If you saw one and didn't know what it was, especially if the skull weren't there, you would think that you had found a deformed human being.
And if you see them bobbing at sea, especially at twilight from a boat, and I have seen that also, they would look like the bobbing heads of drowning sailors. So you can see, I've seen this, and it is creepy, and it's even more creepy when you think about being in northern waters where you get that weird light quality for sometimes several hours in the summer.
Yeah, and this shows up in funny places. There's one version, I think it's one version of a hero visiting a giant's hall where a ball game is being played with a red-hot seal head. There are a number of odd Scandinavian magical traditions involving fishing and lakes and occasional curses that involve taking a seal's skull and putting it up. These are decidedly creepy creatures. In Greenland, the influence seems to have been thrown more into walruses, and we see witches taking the form of walruses occasionally, again with completely evil intentions.
And now I'm thinking of the walruses on the docks, and or I think they're sea lions.
Sea lions.
Sea lions, yeah, but they're the same big critters coming up on the beach. Which do walruses do that too? Do they?
Walruses do that.
Yeah, so
all the pinnipeds do that.
So that you get this kind of odd interaction between people and.
Yeah, well, one of the things particularly about the seals and walruses is that they're not confined to one element. They're water creatures, but they're also land creatures. They're creatures of the borders. They're creatures that can cross between. And the other significant place seals show up, of course, is in the battle between Heimdallr and Loki. In Loki's case, it's assumed that, well, he's a very accomplished shapeshifter. He can do all sorts of things. The seal is the only form that we ever see Heimdallr taking other than his own, but considering that his mothers are quite possibly the Nine Waves, that it's hardly a surprising association to make. But anyway, that is the seal hunt for what it's worth, which is a great deal, because one other thing that may have contributed to the particular caution of seals, aside from the obvious observational things we just mentioned, is hunting seals is not only dangerous because you're out there in a small boat with large, occasionally aggressive creatures with big sharp teeth on them, but if you are actually butchering the seal, you have to be very, very careful that there's not even the slightest cut on your hand, because it's very easy to get seal sickness. There's a sort of toxin or pathogen they produce that can get into any cut with fairly horrible local consequences.
And without being too graphic, for my listeners that for modern people who if we eat meat at all, probably get it in packages where it's all nicely done. It is incredibly easy to nick yourself when even if you're just trying to build a campfire, much less actually butchering animals, which is a very difficult, tiresome, and painstaking task that involves a lot of skill with a knife.
Yeah, and when you think of the Norse understanding of infection as a hostile force, a hostile entity entering your body, you can really see why it would be important to be very cautious with seals, and why seals might be considered especially dangerous in a spiritual sense.
And why Thor might be partly in charge of sea hunting.
Exactly. Yeah, because as I've mentioned previously, Thor is, as far as we can tell, or was the number one healing deity, specifically because he is the god that directly fights, does most of the fighting against hostile things of all sorts. Ettins, trolls, worms, ill-willing elves, witches, what have you.
And I think we want to say a little bit here too. Again, if any of my particularly modern vegetarian listeners are still listening, we're dealing with a different time here, and a time when people had to eat meat in order to survive. You cannot get through a northern European winter, especially in a place, say, like Greenland, where most of the vegetation has gone away without hunting. And one of the things we're trying to get across here is that hunting has a very spiritual element where you have an interaction with the gods and the animals, and you're not just taking them for granted or going out. And the way I used to think of hunting when I lived particularly in the deep south for a while, and I was a young woman and not familiar with it, and once a year I'd see guys get drunk and dressed up in funny clothes and go shoot animals at each other, often drunk off their asses and just being crazy. And that's really not what real hunting is.
No, I think it's safe to say that to our ancestors, even in the Viking Age, who were nearly as far removed in time from the hunting-gathering Stone Age as we are right now, comparatively speaking, hunting was probably the single activity when the individual was closest to that direct connection with the other world. That was the central feature of spiritual life in the hunting-gathering Stone Age. In the case of hunting, rather than relying on the tribal shaman, because we didn't have tribal shamans anymore as such, the hunter still had to go out. The hunter had to basically take on a part of that role, going out into the other world, negotiating with Skozrauet, or Skadi, or Klur, or Miliki, or Tapio, if he was a Finn, and listen, perceive in order to actually find the game. It was, and still is, one of the most intensely involved individual spiritual things possible.
And I want to point out, too, that I don't know that they were that far removed, in a sense, any more than we are, because I read something the other day that I thought was rather surprising, but not when I thought about it. And that was something like 6 months after the Great Depression hit the United States in the 1930s, nearly all the game was hunted out anywhere near people. So even we who think that we're so civilized and that all of our animals are domestic and we never would have to do this, just a small little glitch could create a situation where people realize they have to start actually hunting again and interacting. And when you do that, I mean, I know you've been hunting, and you may want to talk about that a bit, like a little bit on your bear hunt if you want to before we close. But I know that it's very different than just going out to the barnyard and getting a chicken.
Yeah, well, where I was also going is that it's in hunting in times of famine, where we see people reverting most closely to the practices closest to shamanism. I already mentioned Thor Hockler and his whale, and there's another very good example from the early days in Iceland. I think it's in Íslendingabók, where Iceland was having one of its regular famines, and a woman by the name of Þuríður Sundafitler, Þuríður Soundfiller, quote, did Sather to drag in a shoal of herring close to shore. Now, this is interesting in a few ways. The word used in the saga is Seidr. And, it's clear that what she's done is in some way she has mentally coerced these herring to come in and be caught and eaten. Okay, yeah, it's Seidr, but honestly, guys, who cares about the mental integrity of a herring? They're not exactly the shining lights of intellect of the animal world. But in terms of the hunting and fishing, one of the interesting things about Thurither is that she was from Hålogaland. She was from northern Norway, which was also the Sami area. And what she did is very similar to the fishing Sami magics for bringing in fish. So it's very possible that Thurither had, as many another Norse person, especially Norse women in that area did, had learned from the local Sami, and was in fact practicing a Sami magic, which the author of the saga did not have any better term than Seidr to describe. And, technically, yeah, Seidr, it's not non-consensual mental or spiritual manipulation. So it's a reasonable use. But the main thing is that she's using the hunting magic of a very definitely shamanic culture in this context.
The other thing that I'm noting now is that the fact that it may just be that they used a word because they only had that word. But the other thing that occurred to me is when even with shamanic magic or with the type of magic used to call animals by hunters and gatherers that we know of, that it comes down to us, there are two ways of doing it. And it may depend on your circumstance or the animal. And one of which is to do, I think, what Thor Hotler did, where you go and you call the whale.
Yeah. Well, he called Thor.
Or he called Thor.
He called Thor, and Thor sent the whale.
So that's using it. That's actually a third way. That's using a deity to send you something. Then there's like some of the Northwest Coast people do, where they go out and they ask Grandfather Whale to send a whale who was willing to sacrifice themselves for the human people, and they will give acknowledge. So that's asking.
Yeah,
calling.
And that's a bit more similar to the Sami and Suomi bear rights, where the bear is given all these honors, not least because they want to get more bears.
Yeah, and then finally you have this compulsionary magic, which I think would be Seidr, where, like you said, you go and I don't know. It would be a very interesting somebody's PhD dissertation to look around the world with traditions we still know. Do you do this with like smaller animals or things like fish that you really don't, or you compel the mice to leave your kitchen? What I mean? You're not good. If the cat doesn't eat them, you're not going to want to have a conversation with the mouse. Generally, you just want it gone.
Yeah.
But it would be Seidr.
Yeah.
Whereas talking to Grandfather Whale would be something else.
Right, and we don't really see any sense of talking to the collective spirit at all in the Norse.
So that's a very Native American.
At least not with animals. We may see it with plants sometime.
Oh, okay.
Particularly hemp. If you passed a hemp field, you were supposed to take off your hat in respect for the white. And there's a few other hints here and there that suggest that there might have been collective plant spirit, but we don't see collective animal spirit so much. We see relationships with individual animals quite a bit. But that's as far as it seems to go. Whereas, again, you move towards the more shamanic culture, and there is much more of a linkage between the animal as individual and the animal is, kind of collective species.
Right. Okay. Well, that's really interesting. Did you want to talk at all about your spiritual journey with your bear hunt, or do you want to save that for another time?
It's a good question. I think I will probably save that for another time.
Well, that's fine. Then, so to sum up, I keep thinking when we're talking about this that, again, this is very far removed from most people's experience, unless they, at least particularly modern heathens, except for possibly some young men and women who like to go out and shoot things. And for them, I think this show should be particularly appropriate because you may want to start looking at a little bit of the spiritual dimensions of what you're doing, as well as just the sport involved. But how can we take some of this and say use it for hunting when we're not actually hunting animals, or is there a way to do that, like hunting knowledge or hunting for an answer?
I'm not really sure that it does apply in the sense of imagery and understanding. It makes sense, but most of our hunting rituals are very, very concrete, and they're directed at beings that are one way or another associated with the natural animals, as with Skolsraut or Hurat, or deities that are really, again, fairly focused on the nature, fairly focused on the wild. And again, I have to emphasize that sense of physically, personally going out into the borderlands, going out into the wilds. I think that's one of the things about hunting that I find to be, if you like, the most spiritually intense, the most spiritually illuminating, is the fact that it unites the physical, including the physical danger I mentioned, the physical presence in the woods, the separation from the mundane world, from particularly in the modern age, our sense of time, our sense of clocks, and puts you in a situation which is essentially unchanged from our Stone Age ancestors. Our weapons may be a little bit better, and if you asked me to choose between Stone Age weapons and a 375 H&H in hunting a grizzly bear, I know which I'd choose.
I know which one I'd want you to take, too.
Yeah, I'm a married man. You'd like me back in one piece.
Yes.
But, not except for that difference, which the many hunting accidents every year show, isn't that much of a safeguard. You're pretty much doing exactly what your Stone Age ancestors did in exactly the same way, with exactly the same results, except that, of course, if you've managed to get up Skolsrowit's nose or something and make it back alive, you're not going to starve because you can go to the grocery store all winter.
My other question would be then, because I'm thinking about this and I'm thinking, so actually the closest that, say, a person who didn't want to actually physically hunt animals might be able to get would be the modern custom that is sometimes actually works with wildlife people and stuff, where you go out with a camera.
Yeah.
And you especially stalk the animal and you do all the things that you would do, except instead of killing them, you risk yourself by taking their picture or tagging them with a collar or this sort of thing.
That's part of it, but the kill is also part of it.
I think that's a spiritual component that really...
That's a major spiritual component. As a substitute for the person, who doesn't want to shoot, who doesn't eat meat, what have you, I would actually suggest hunting mushrooms. We call it hunting for a reason, because it's a lot more like hunting than gathering. It requires the same spiritual and mental attention, the same separation, the same sense that they will turn up when they turn up, unpredictably, by the blessings of the gods and the whites. If you're going to do this, don't just rely on a book. Get somebody to show you the mushrooms, because a mistake in identifying mushrooms can also be real fatal.
But that's also like hunting. You need someone to show you how to do it. I think that's a really great way to end. That was really what I was going for, was something that people could do, or if they live in a city and they're just not. I've never actually hunted except birds when I was a child, and that was, a long time ago, and it's just, I would do it if I needed to. but I'm much more comfortable with handling domestic animals than I am hunting. And like I said, I will fish if required, but I don't want to eat the results.
Yeah.
I would if I was starving, but I'd just rather hand them to somebody else. And again, it's just not something that I'm that interested in, but I can see the power and the attraction and I was hoping for a way that some people could do this if they didn't have access or didn't want to go out with
mushrooms and possibly wild herbs, but mushrooms are interesting because they're kind of in between.
Yeah, I'm getting that sense of twilight. And I actually have some pictures that I took a few years ago here in our little tiny bit of woods where our then housemate told me to go out with a camera because there were fairy rings of mushrooms in the twilight. It was just really cool. And again, I get that sense of between. Well, I think this has been a really great show. I want to thank you for talking about a topic that hopefully my listeners are still with me at this point. It is a little controversial, but I think only because we really don't understand it that well anymore.
Yeah, and keep in mind, every single one of you is here because your ancestors hunted, killed, and ate animals. Exactly.
So we can talk about our options on another show. I think that would actually be a good show topic. But I think for now, I think it's a good point to end on. So I want to thank you for being with us this evening. And I want to thank my listeners for being with us. And I look forward to seeing you once again next week. Oh, never mind. We've got a question here.
Yeah, just last word here. Since it's that time of year, I wanted to wish happy hunting to y'all.
Well, good hunting to you too. Good night, everyone, from Cat's Eye on the Future. You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.